Hello and welcome to Dig It. I'm Peter Brown and hosting the show with me today is Chris Day. Hi Chris.
Hi Peter. We are delighted to welcome Catrina Fenton, who is the head of the Heritage Seed Library at Garden Organics. Hello Catrina and welcome to Dig It. And where and how do we find you today?
Oh, hello and thank you for having me. Well, I'm currently at our Ryton HQ, that's just outside Coventry. It's the home of the Heritage Seed Library, and it's where we do all of our growing and processing and storing of heritage seeds. So I'm sat here with a cup of tea at what is quite exciting and busy time of year for us when we are sending lots of seeds out to our members. So I'm really pleased to be able to stop and have a chat with you.
Well, that's great. So now I'm sure many of our listeners will know the great work which is obviously carried out by Garden Organics. However, it would be really good to sort of start the conversation to sort of set the scene as far as the Seed Heritage Library, which maybe some of our listeners don't know about and which we obviously would like to enthuse them with your knowledge today.
Of course. Yes, absolutely. I mean, we've been around for a little while now. We've been around since the 1970s. And Lawrence Hills, who's the founder of Garden Organic, the charity that we're part of, one of our key projects. So Lawrence Hills, he was an absolute pioneer, founding Garden Organic, and he originally set up the Henry Doubleday Research Association in Bocking, near Braintree in Essex, back in 1954. We're now known as Garden Organic. By the time he retired in 1986, HDRA was the largest body of organic gardeners in the world. And we've moved to Ryton, which is where I am now, near Coventry. Lawrence Hills, he was a prolific author, and many of his publications, including Fertility Without Fertilisers, Down-to-Earth Gardening and Organic Gardening. But he was also best known for his Grow Your Own Fruit and Vegetables book, published back in 1971. It rapidly became a really important reference book, a go-to place for information about gardeners and self-sufficiency and commercial organic gardening. So in terms of the Heritage Seed Library, well, we were established back in the 1970s. And really this goes all the way back to what was happening to seed legislation at the time. And that was a real catalyst for Lawrence Hills to start up the seed library. So we'd recently joined the European Economic Community, and with that came an overhaul of seed regulations around marketing and trading seeds. So up to that point, seed was available to farmers and gardeners across Europe. But in the 1970s, this legislation was brought in, making it illegal to commercially market seeds or varieties that weren't included on a national and a wider European list, on the UK national list or the European Common Catalogue. And with that new regulation came a whole load of stringent tests that seed had to be demonstrated to be uniform and stable and unique. And with that came some additional costs. And Lawrence at the time realised that this new sort of regulation would have a real potential damaging impact on the availability of seed. And he was quite right. Many varieties simply fell out of favour, not just because the varieties wouldn't pass these stringent tests, but also because growers and seed maintainers simply weren't prepared to take on the cost of doing that. So he set up the Heritage Seed Library. Initially, he started a national gene bank at Horticultural Research International in Wellesbourne in Warwickshire, which is now part of Warwick University. And the creation of the seed library sort of followed out of that. It was originally part of the Genetic Resources Unit, a kind of tiny collection of varieties that were being grown for, largely for a display to raise public awareness, but has now formed into what we know now as the Heritage Seed Library, a national collection of heritage vegetable varieties which we maintain as seed.
Excellent. So can I just ask you a sort of a bit of a question on the Millennium Seed Bank? Because obviously that's over at Wakehurst, isn't it? Do you working in collaboration at all with the Millennium Seed Bank over at it's Wakehurst Place, isn't it?
That's right. So the Millennium Seed Bank is looking after kind of our wild relatives, our natural species within the UK. It has pretty much 100% of the UK's species of wildflowers and other wild plants. We deal with cultivated biodiversity, so we look after vegetables rather than that. But we do have a relationship with them. We're both members of the UK Plant Genetic Resources Group, So both of our important genetic resources and the way that we look after them form this national inventory of UK plant genetic resources. But we both collect very different things in terms of our collections and the way we run our seed.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, I'm going to say grand work, but by both parties then. So perhaps Catrina, can you sort of how does the seed library work in today? How the day-to-day side of the sort of processes?
Yeah, sure. So as an organisation, we're a registered charity. We're a conservation organisation, membership organisation. So all the varieties that we look after, and we've got about 800 vegetable varieties in the collection. These all continue to be ones that have not been commercially listed, so didn't make it onto the UK national list or the European Common Catalogue as it was. And we look after these varieties ourselves. We have a growing space on site here at Ryton, and we also have a fantastic network of growers, volunteer growers, our seed guardians who grow for us. We continue to be under the same sort of regulations, so we do not sell the seeds, we can't sell the seeds, and instead our members, we have about 7,000 of them, support us to do the work we do, and in return they are able to access the seed once a year through our annual seed list, in which we make about 150 of our 800 varieties available, and they can choose their 6 packets of seeds each year. So they support us financially and also as seed guardians, some of them, and in return we're able to conserve this collection and research and look for new varieties that we can take into our collection as a growing and living collection of vegetables.
Excellent. And with regards to the sort of people who can access the seeds and then get their 6 varieties, do they then return some of the seeds that they've grown in from the fruits back to you, or?
Well, they don't need to do that. If they want to pick their 6 packets, they can, but about 100 and grow and enjoy them, of course, and eat them, because that's what we want. We want them to be a living collection and people to actually use these varieties.
Right.
But out of those 7,000 members, we have about 170 who are volunteers who've taken on the additional responsibility of growing for seed and returning seed for us. So we have a separate list of heritage varieties, usually about 30 to 50 varieties each year that we need a little bit of extra help with, and we send them out some seed and they grow that seed, and hopefully by the end of the year send us an awful lot back. So that seed that they support us as seed guardians with helps to replenish our seed library, and also when we have sufficient seed we can then share it with our members more widely.
Okay, because just thinking sort of how long does the average seed last?
Well, it depends on the vegetable type, and every seed has got its own shelf life.
Oh, right.
So you can imagine here the planning is quite a big process in terms of what we decide what to grow and what we decide to share with our members. So if you take something like a carrot or parsnip, perhaps the shelf life is only going to be 1 or 2 years before the germination rate starts to drop off. But if you're a cabbage or some other kind of brassica, or maybe even a cucumber seed, that shelf life is a lot longer, maybe 10 years, if they're stored in the right conditions, which is nice and dry and nice and cool. Yes. So we have a continuous cycle of growing out, but also good, viable seed that we can then share with our members as well.
Okay. And how do you keep the varieties pure, as it were?
That's a really good question. And some things are easier than others. We'd certainly say if you haven't saved seed before, always give it a go, but maybe start with the easy stuff. So something like a pea or a tomato or French bean. Generally, they're quite happy self-pollinators, generally low risk of cross-pollinating, and you can grow quite a small population of plants and have a good genetic, good healthy gene pool for that seed. Mm. For something like something trickier, brassicas are probably the hardest. Certainly biennial brassicas are the hardest for us to do that. So we have to do an awful lot of intervention in order to keep the seed true to type. So even something like a broad bean, which we're all familiar with in terms of seed production, we do need quite a big isolation distance from another broad bean. And of course, that's not really practical for us. I think we need at least half a mile from another variety or a field bean. So what we do, we grow them in polytunnels.
Okay.
And they're all sealed off. They've got nice mesh sides to keep the insects out.
Yep.
But of course, if you're keeping the insects out, then you also need to somehow enable them
pollinate
to
them, yeah.
to pollinate. So a huge amount of work that my lovely team and our fantastic volunteers do on site is a lot of hand pollination. So something like a runner bean or a broad bean, we'll actually bring paintbrushes in, and we use paintbrushes to transfer pollen across flowers, across plants in order to pollinate them.
Yeah.
But we also do introduce pollinators as well. So I get slightly funny looks, but never any questions, which I'm always rather amused at when I pop down to the local angler's shop and we buy white maggots.
Right.
Bring them back. It's a favourite time of year, as you can imagine. We're really popular with the rest of the staff on site when we bring back quite a few pints of maggots, pop them in a crate with some sawdust and keep them covered, and they will happily pupate and then hatch into blowflies, which we can then release into a polytunnel. So,
and the blowflies then do the pollination, do they?
They do. They're not, they're not quite as efficient as bees, but you can imagine that's slightly more technical to manage bees in tunnels. Yeah. The flies, they're able to do that job for us, particularly with vegetable types that we can't really easily hand pollinate. So I'm talking here things like brassicas, where you've got lots of tiny self-incompatible flowers where you do really need to move that pollen around, or alliums, something like that. And they do the job for you, but you definitely want to have your mouth shut when you're wandering around.
Brilliant.
Yes. Yeah, you paint a good picture. On the seeds then, it might be worth explaining, obviously, to gardeners that the two main types you come across. You mentioned, Catrina, about open pollinated, but what about F1 hybrids? What's the difference there on the production of the seed?
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually, and it's worth mentioning that all of the varieties that we look after in our collection are all open pollinated, which is why we're using these methods to bring that pollen, move it around, and make sure that we produce good viable seed as a result. F1 hybrids, on the other hand, in a nutshell, I suppose, they're produced by a very, very controlled process of pollination across different highly selected varieties to produce kind of one-off, a single generation of hybrid seed. And that is to produce a plant that's going to have specific features, so it can have particular vigour in growth. But, and certainly in terms of seed saving, the seed saved from an F1 hybrid is not going to produce a plant necessarily with the same characteristics of the parent. So the whole breeding process has to be done annually, and if you're someone who grows using F1 hybrids, it means you have to go back and buy new seed each time you want to grow a new generation. In contrast, the open pollinated seed, which is the seed that we're dealing with, we can maintain that true to type with a bit of care, with our helpful blowflies and hand pollinating from one generation to the next. And those parent plants are going to contain their genetics is going to be passed down to the next generation of seed. So it means you can save your own seed. If you've got something you particularly like, it's an open pollinated variety, you're good for one generation to the next if you carefully save that seed.
Yeah, I mean, I think for most gardeners, isn't it, that the open pollinated varieties, especially your veg, tend to mature at different times. So especially if you've got an allotment and you want a good crop of cabbage, they're not going to all ripen or develop or be harvestable at the same time, which obviously with an F1 hybrid, that's what they're designed to be ready on a specific week from being sown on a particular time. So you've got a bit more flexibility, which I suppose for most home gardeners, that's still quite an important factor for choosing varieties.
Absolutely. I mean, there are various features that F1 hybrids are looking for, and they may be of particular value as a feature. But yes, you're quite right. Many of the varieties we've got in our collection, you've got succession harvesting involved, which is not particularly great if you're doing it on a large agricultural scale. But for a home gardener, it's perfect. You've got something that's got a nice long harvesting season, and from an open pollinated position alone, it's always worth noting that these varieties are always going to be inherently genetically variable. So each plant is always going to be slightly different from the next one, and that variability allows for adaptation and for plants that work well in a particular area to keep being selected and seed saved for them for that particular benefit for that grower in that area.
Indeed.
So, Catrina, you mentioned you've got 800 varieties of vegetables on the heritage list at the moment. Does that number change, or how does it evolve?
Yeah, the Heritage Seed Library collection itself, although we're at about 800, it's expanding and contracting all the time. And certainly part of our conservation work, a really important part of what we do, is to try and find those next little gems that we can bring into the collection. And these could be anything from an heirloom, which is very often a variety that's been grown by a particular family. Perhaps the original name of it has been lost, and Uncle Fred or Auntie Jean started saving their own seeds when they weren't able to buy them again, and they've taken on the name of that variety. So we've got lots of those in the collection. And some of them are ex-commercial varieties that have dropped off the commercial listing. Usually they've got a really great history, a good provenance behind them, and we're able to then get our hands on those seeds and grow them out and bring them into the collection. So this year we trialled 5 varieties. They included an ex-commercial variety, and they included several heirloom varieties. So these are varieties that had been grown in a particular area. We had one from the Rhondda in Wales, for example, had a prize-winning runner bean that we were really pleased to bring into the collection. And at the other end of the scale, actually some varieties that we've been custodians on for some years, they get taken on commercially again, and that's a really good success story. So we've managed to look after them. Actually, they become rated really well as a variety that people will be interested in buying, and a commercial seed company will take them on, and our kind of conservation work is done. We can take them out of the collection, and we can move our attention onto our queue. We've got about 30, 35 varieties sitting in our cold store still to be assessed. So we've always got a continuous cycle of heritage varieties being taken in and taken out of the collection, which is how it should be. We definitely want to be conserving things that are out there, but we also want to make sure that they are able to be made more widely available when they can be.
Okay, Catrina, can I just ask also, looking at the seed library, what do you think the major benefits of growing the seed heritage seeds are for the home gardener? So thinking, what sort of benefits do you think the home gardener is going to benefit from these varieties, which obviously they may never have come across before, or they may have heard them anecdotally? Yes,
of course. I mean, I always it sits in the back of my mind when we're doing this role is that someone somewhere at some point thought, do you know what, I really rate this variety and I'm going to save the seed from it. And very often that's how that comes across to us. We end up with it on our doorstep to say, look, have a look at this one. It's been grown for decades. It's really good. And from an open pollinated position alone, it's really important that we've got this sort of adaptable genetic biodiversity, this cultivated biodiversity out there. People can continue to grow and benefit from. But that variability, that genetic variability and that adaptability, that's also explains why so many of the varieties in our collection have been considered special for someone to save the seed from. And, it could be that it demonstrates an evidence of drought resistance or bolt resistance or a fantastic flavour that they haven't come across before. Or like we said earlier, the fact that you can potentially pick at different times of the year and have a long harvest. So it's not just about having something a little bit special or a little bit different that you can't really easily get your hands on, but it's also about that important cultivated biodiversity that underpins it all. And if you think about it, if you go to your shop or your supermarket, we've got about 190 tomato varieties in the collection. It's just not something that you see out there. And each of those varieties at some point, they have a particular value to that person who grew and saved the seed. And it's about underpinning that food security and the choices that we have as growers, really, and all part of the picture of the varieties in our collection.
Yeah, and sort of following on from that, I'm sure the most important thing for home gardeners, certainly when I'm growing vegetables or fruit, greenhouse fruits, is flavour, and that has to be sort of fundamentally, obviously the problem sometimes with F1 hybrids, commercial varieties which obviously are grown for the supermarkets, the flavour is always well down the list. So hopefully you're going to have commercial growers coming to the Seed Heritage Library to get those wonderful genetics back into flavour.
Yeah, absolutely. A good example this year is we grew tomato It's called Golden Yellow Queen. 19th century, from the States actually originally. Really lovely tomato, really lovely flavour to it, but really thin skin, and it's definitely not the kind of variety that you're going to find bouncing in the back of the lorry to a supermarket or sitting on a shelf there for any length of time. But it's a good example of one that's just a value to home growers. They want something a little bit different, but they also want something that tastes fantastic, but doesn't necessarily meet the market requirements for a very consistent tomato on a shelf somewhere. So, that's all part of what we have in the collection. And if it's got the added bonus of perhaps being blight resistant or even, drought resistant or performing well under particular environmental pressures, then these are all really important resources that benefit our future resilience, particularly in the face of challenges like climate change, for example.
Yes, I think climate change is going to be a major sort of factor, isn't it, over the next few years? Is that something when you're doing your assessments for varieties, when you are when these new heirloom varieties come into your hands and you grow them perhaps for the first year, is there an assessment process on the factors that the seed is going to need, from germination sort of onwards?
Yeah, when we do these assessment trials, and we talked about the 5 that we've done this year, what's important, it's quite a rigorous process. And if you think about it, for some heirloom variety that, belongs to a family member, this might be the first time that they've been described in such detail. So we'll take lots of photographs, we do lots of measurements, we compare them with varieties that we've already got in the collection just to see if there's something a bit special about them. And we'd love to do more formal research about the varieties and their certain resistances and resiliences and sensitivities as well. And that's why we value our members' feedback so much. So many of them will come back and say, do you know what, this is the best performing this, that and the other that we've had. It works really well in my conditions, and it's got through. It's the last one standing in a really hot summer or something along those lines. Then we gather all of that information about these, and we can share that with our members who are really interested to find out what works well for them where they live. So I think there's a huge amount more work that we'd love to be doing, and which is why we partner up with organisations like Coventry University. So this year and the last few years, they've been doing comparison trials with heritage varieties and their equivalent varieties for certain legumes, comparing all sorts of things around nutrients and attractiveness to pollinators and yield and vigour and those kinds of things. And we haven't got the full data yet, and it's a small project, but heritage varieties stand up pretty well against some of these criteria. So again, a really important resource that we want to maintain as a living collection to use.
Yeah, indeed, and obviously you're doing groundwork in that direction. A question we had got down here was how is there a sort of status of a heritage variety? Is there one key thing which would then get it into the library? Would it be flavour, or would it be its backstory? Anecdotally,
it's a good question actually, and that's because there isn't really a very strict definition. And there's a lot of overlap in the way that we describe our collection. But really, we kind of group them into 3 types, really, in a nutshell. Firstly, you've got your true historic landrace varieties, perhaps something you could look up in a book. Could be decades, could be hundreds of years old. In fact, the oldest thing that we have in the collection is an old broad bean, a kind of field bean called Martock. And that would have been quite a staple for medieval diets. And we know that the sort of descriptive records for that particular variety go back to about 1293, 1294, something like that. What we have in our collection is much younger than that, mostly 18th, 19th and 20th century varieties. We also have a large proportion of heirlooms, so I mentioned named after relatives, uncles and aunties, and places and people and characters. They're ideally at least predate the 1970s, and some of them go back into the 19th, 18th, 17th century as well. And we do have a small proportion of ex-commercial varieties. And again, that third group ideally predates the 1970s when the seed regulations came in. But actually, we're always on the lookout for varieties, more modern cultivars that have been commercially maintained but dropped So, for example, this year, one of the 5 varieties that we trialled, that was Histon Cropper Tomato, and it did used to be available for sale around the 2000, year 2000 to 2003, something along those lines, but has since been dropped. We're always on the lookout for more recent varieties that are no longer available. So under those circumstances, we would be looking at a more recent variety. But as heritage, more generally, at least predates the 1970s, but as old as possible, really, that we can get our hands on would be good.
And if somebody had, a particular variety, they would just basically contact you at the seed library. I mean, what would be the process? Do they have to do a proper would there be a sort of form to fill in? Would it be, or would you just matter of sending some seeds to you and say, look, this is the story? Take it from there.
We do have a process. We do get contacted a lot by people who've gone, I've got this seed, it's great. Do you think this could be something that we bring into the Heritage Seed Library? Probably get about 20, 30 inquiries like that every year, and it's always really exciting to look at it. We always go through quite a stringent process before we even get to the grow out stage, the trial assessment stage, because very often we'll discover that they're actually a commercial variety, but they're just not quite recognise that, or they're synonymous with a commercial variety, which we don't really need to conserve. So we do ask some questions about them, about where they came from, how old people think they are, what the backstory is, who grew them, what are they called, what's so special about them. And it's once they've passed those initial checks that we will then go, do you know what, this would be great for us to have an opportunity to grow this, have a look at this variety. And it's when we've done that growing trial that we can then decide, A, whether it's what we're expecting to see, secondly, whether it's cross-pollinated, that sometimes happens, unfortunately, and also to check for generally good health, so that we know that we've got good viable seed. And it's from that point that we're able to inform the donor that we're delighted to take this variety onto the collection, hopefully. And that's been the case with all of the ones we've grown this year. We were pleased that they were all good. We could include them in the collection. And it's from that point that we can then, we've secured that variety. We will keep regenerating the seed. We will share it with our members. We might get our seed guardians to help us look after it. And then it's secured then in our collection, which is a really, really important part of what we're trying to do.
Very interesting. And with regards to English vegetables, I mean, when you were walking around the allotments, you see lots of vegetables that people are growing, like potatoes from sort of South America and strawberries from France, or the garden strawberry that's originated from France. Can you give us some examples of some vegetables that are actually native to the United Kingdom, and any good recommendations for the varieties of those vegetables to look out for?
Yeah, and I think historically, I think it's fair to say that we've probably got quite a lot to thank the Robins for when it comes to introducing crops, and of course since then, further afield, and what we do consider familiar in our veg pack certainly has, the crops have a really long history that reaches across the world. I suppose depending on how far back you go, really, to our crop wild relatives, and we've probably moved on a little bit since Swedes and kale, which is perhaps more traditionally associated with the UK. Although it's worth saying we do have some really lovely kale varieties and Swede varieties in our collection, something like Ragged Jack, for example, and other varieties that are more modern cultivars. But I suppose it's worth saying that all of the crops that we grow today, certainly the seed that we produce at the Heritage Seed Library, because it's all grown in the UK, it is all suitable for UK growing conditions. So, a good example of that, perhaps, that we have in our collection, which is really popular, for example, is Robinson pea. So that's an heirloom variety, originates in Scotland, and has been around at least since the 1950s, for example. It's both cold hardy and drought resistant and really vigorous. It's got 2 meters plus plant and produces really lovely pods over a very long season, which is great to eat fresh and great for frozen.
Excellent. And is that going to get eaten by my mice on the allotment as well?
It's probably highly mice approved as well. Possibly slug approved as well. Yes, we're all face, certainly for us here on the site at Writers, we often find that our varieties are very popular with all kinds of general pests, basically.
Excellent. Maybe I'll try those next year then. Let's see if I can actually grow some peas. It's been a bane of my life for the last 7-8 years. I've tried sowing peas, and they just always seem to get eaten, but never mind.
Yeah.
That's life, isn't it?
You have my sympathy.
So on the stories then, anecdotally, over all the varieties you've sort of curated over the years, Catrina, is there any other sort of stories you'd like to share? Anything which might give us a bit of an insight into the background of these wonderful varieties?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think, but certainly for our members, really part of what we really enjoy about doing this role here at the Heritage Seed Library is that we've got a really good fair share of really interesting tales attached to our seeds. Sometimes very tall tales. I'm particularly fond of our claims of some of the varieties we've got in our collection. We've got, for example, we've got quite a few what we call mummies peas, and they make certain claims about being found in Egyptian tombs many years ago. But we love them to bits because, they're a great example of 1920s varieties and often a bit of cheeky kind of enterprising spirit of the time associated with Egyptology and Egypt mania that was happening in the 1920s. So, we will affectionately include those stories in our collection. And we've got some really beautiful French bean seeds with specific markings on them that look like soldiers or angels or mysterious figures that people have created and cultivated over time. We've got stories about varieties being salvaged from shipwrecks, all of those kinds of tall tales and interesting background stories. But I think very often some of the best stories are those that link the people to the varieties themselves. And there's quite a dramatic story around one of the tomato varieties we've got. It's called Marianne's Peace, and it's the variety that dates back to the turn of the century. So Marianna was a farmer's daughter from Czechoslovakia at the time, and she managed to escape Russian captivity during World War II by jumping from a truck that was transporting her off to Siberia somewhere. But despite being shot at, and she managed to escape and got to the safety of Bavaria, and these were the seeds that her father gave her before he died, and they produced really lovely, very large pink-red fruits, really large fruits that have been kept in the collection. So even really, really dramatic stories to the sublime and slightly ridiculous. They're all in there in the collection, and I think they add a bit of colour to what is already an interesting range of varieties of vegetables to grow.
Most definitely, yeah. That does the backstories, however wacky and wild and surreal they might be, does put a perspective on the fact that it's something people, ultimately grow and they have passion about growing, doesn't it? So that's good.
Exactly.
So, as far as our listeners to dig it are concerned, what sort of tips could you perhaps give us, Catrina, about saving seed in our own gardens?
Well, first of all, I think everyone should give it a go. It's really great. It's quite addictive. Once you start saving your own seed and you realise what fun it is, you might want to continue to do that. I would suggest certainly vegetable seed. That's our thing here. So if you haven't saved seed before, definitely give it a go with some really simple varieties to begin with. Tomatoes, I really like saving seeds from those because you actually get to enjoy the tomatoes as well. So a top tip would be, if you're growing some tomato plants, the good news is you harvest your seed at the same time as it is ripe to eat. So you can take a tomato, cut it in half, scoop out the seeds from inside, and the way we process the seed here is a very simple method. It's a fermentation method. So have a jam jar ready, take your spoon, scoop your seed into the jam jar, cover it with a few centimetres of water, and then allow that seed to ferment slightly, probably somewhere between 3 or 5 days. Might smell a bit funny, but don't worry, keep it somewhere sort of room temperature. And what you're trying to do is remove that gelatinous coating from the seed. You have some really nice clean seed that you can dry out nicely on a flat surface, ideally not something that can stick to like paper. And then you've got some great tomato seed. And tomato seed's got really nice long shelf life, probably at least 6 or 7 years if you keep it in good condition. So once you've got that seed, you've got a nice supply of tomato seed for some time. Keep it somewhere dry, not necessarily cool, but ideally cool, but drying conditions are most important, and then you'll have a lovely seed supply. Or just leave a few pods from your French bean or your pea plant to really dry out, and again do the same thing, not ferment it, but keep it nice and dry and cool, and you've got a good supply of seed. The trickier stuff requires some isolation and hand pollinating, but certainly those 3 vegetable types are a great way to start saving seeds themselves.
Yeah, very good idea. And I guess the most important thing is obviously not to have an F1 hybrid to try and save the seed from just a regular heritage or an heirloom variety to start off with.
Yeah, you might. I mean, if you've never done it before and you want to try it, why not save some from an F1 hybrid? But you might be rather surprised at what you get the following year. But certainly,
Yes.
certainly in terms of the process, it's great fun to try.
Excellent. Thanks for that.
And I was going to say, Catrina, on the actual storage, I mean, it's usually sort of airtight containers. I often, Tupperware, or other brands are available, is usually the thing, isn't it? So, I mean, in keeping them obviously dry and obviously individually labelled, any tips on that sort of side of things?
Yeah, well, if you can imagine, we grow out about 100 varieties each year for seed here, so labelling is like really, really important part of what we do here. And even if you're just growing 1 or 2 things for seed, you'd be really surprised, the next year you can't really remember what you've grown. So always have a pencil, piece of paper, envelope, something along those lines. Always mark what you've done and when you've saved the seed. Certainly from a storage point of view, yes, you're quite right. Keeping them nice and dry is really important. If you're just saving seed, maybe just so that you can sow it again the next year, or just save it for a year or 2, something breathable like a paper envelope is probably going to be good enough. If you want to store it for longer term, then yes, something that's air sealed, a jar with a sealed lid or a container with a sealed lid. The most important thing is keeping the moisture out or not trapping moisture in, because that's an enemy for seed saving. So you would want to make sure your seed is sufficiently dry before you do that. And drying your seed, for a small seed, on average, I'm talking anything up to a small cucumber size, maybe a week or so. And for a larger seed, up to a broad bean size, we're talking maybe 2 to 3 weeks. Somewhere out of direct sunlight, somewhere relatively dry, but not somewhere warm or hot, like an airing cupboard or anything like that.
On Catrina, I was going to say, on the oldest seed you've ever germinated at the Heritage Seed Library. I mean, I just wonder, have you got actual records, sort of going back to the 1970s and beyond?
That's really interesting, actually, because since I've been here, I think the harvest we did in 2020, we harvested a cabbage from seed that was 29 years old. So that was actually named Green Wonder. I think that's a record certainly in the time I've been at the seed library. In fact, the seed was older than some of the staff actually cultivating it, which was all amusing. But as each vegetable type will have a different optimum shelf life, and brassicas have got a really long shelf life. So it would be quite unusual to have anything over 30 years old that's been sitting in our cold store that we could successfully germinate. But fortunately, with this particular example, we had lots and lots of seeds. So even if only a small percentage was viable, we were able to grow up enough plants from that seed stock. So I think 29 years is probably a record.
That's a pretty competent number, isn't it? Yes. Yeah. Certainly, yes.
We do freeze some of our seed, and we have a backup collection at Warwick University at Wellesbourne, where Lawrence Hill's originally set out for the vegetable gene bank, and they are our black box, our backup collection, should anything happen to the collection here on site. So freezing the seed, if it's sufficiently dry, that can extend that even further. So, easily beyond 30 years. But, we generally grow out within the lifespan of the seed, anywhere on average around 5 years before we next grow one of the heritage vegetables in our collection.
Well, my next question really is something we were chatting, Peter, when we were a couple of episodes back about gene editing. It was a news story, and it was suggesting that now that we're out of the EU and things, our British growers can start doing a bit of genetic engineering on varieties of crops. What do you think the impact that could have that on the Seed Heritage Library if that sort of starts to filter through, where more manipulation of crops are going to come into the process? Or do you think it would be just another crop which will have obviously different traits and different qualities to sort of savour and capture for posterity in the future?
Sure. Well, I mean, this is a huge area, and I'm not a geneticist, but if you put aside the issues of regulation and how it's regulated and whether we will change that in the UK post EU, I mean, I think in reality, I suppose, the access to this biotechnology is dominated currently by, just a few multinational companies with a large agricultural focus. So I suppose I'd kind of turn the question on its head somewhat and argue that what we're doing at the Heritage Seed Library has, along with other similar organisations around the world, is that we have access to a huge amount of genetic resource and cultivated biodiversity that could end up in our food systems and address some of the issues that are being presented as being solved only by this technology approach, this biotechnology approach. And importantly, open pollinated crops that we have breeding and selected using conventional methods over decades, if not centuries, are going to continue to be adaptable and potentially address some of the challenges of climate change, etc. Importantly, and this is one of the things that we say about the varieties that we're custodians of in the heritage collection, is that seed then stays in the hands of the growers. That anyone with a little bit of care can save their own seed. They don't need to keep buying more if they don't need to, if they don't want to. And I think that's a really important approach to this in terms of the notion of seed sovereignty, seed miles, of food security, really. And we know how much we've lost over the last 100 years or so. Hundreds, if not thousands, of genetically diverse varieties of vegetable cultivars alone. And those potential important genetic resources are the ones that we're working hard at. And I can't see that changing at all. Finding and sharing those varieties that we know is of interest to our members and to other growers and potential breeders in the future. And that's something that we're going to continue to do with conventional breeding. And it's about what are we trying to achieve and who owns the seed at the end of the day. And I think the open pollinated heritage varieties that we've got answer some of those questions already.
Yes, I see the argument as well. In a way, these conglomerates who are editing existing varieties are trying to remove the problem qualities. In effect, you've got the genetic material to actually add to those varieties naturally to make them drought resistant or whatever. So yeah, it's sort of working from two different sort of points of source, really, isn't it? So yeah, I think it's going to continue and rumble on, I'm sure, in the years to come, because obviously we're becoming more and more conscious of that.
Of course, and we'll be watching this space to see what the landscape looks like.
Indeed. So, Catrina, we usually ask our podcast guests to choose a desert island plant, and in view of the massive, 800 varieties you're growing at Garden Organic and the Heritage Library, which one particularly would you like to grow on your magical, mystical island?
Well, there are just so many to choose from. This is a really, really difficult question, and I've got a particular soft spot. Some of the really beautiful French themes that we've got in our collection, and their lovely seed coats and everything else. But actually, I'm going to go for something a little bit different, given that I would expect there to be, plenty of warmth and sunshine on this desert island.
Yep.
So perhaps I'm going to go for a really magnificent Dudi variety. So a Dudi is a kind of gourd plant. And we've got a few heirloom varieties in our collection, ones that have been adapted to UK growing conditions, have been grown in the UK in allotments all around the country. So perhaps I'd go for one of those. And I think I'm going to go for a variety called Mo Syed. And Mo was actually someone who had an allotment up in Leicester, and variety is named after him. It's originally, the original seeds would have been from India, and Mo was growing a variety that's familiar to him and adapted his own heirloom that was working well in the UK. It produces massive fruits, about the size of a small child when it gets going. I think it could come in quite useful. So if I ever mastered the technique of properly drying out a gourd, I could have containers, things to carry stuff around, or maybe if I selected it and grew it really, really big, maybe I could even hollow it out and paddle off the island.
Oh, okay. I love the ingenuity there. That's a good answer.
That's fantastic.
Great one. Yeah.
And finally, we like to ask our guests for a joke or a funny story related to what you're up to. Have you got anything you'd like to share with us?
Well, I'll spare you the maggot jokes and things that we've experienced here. It's perhaps not to everybody's taste as listeners to your podcast, but I mentioned that we've got some really lovely, really pretty French beans in the collection. They're ranging from various markings of figures and really beautiful colours and shiny, multicoloured seed coats. And sometimes when I've been out speaking to gardening groups or events, I'll bring with me some really big sweetie jars, these old-fashioned sweetie jars, and we'll fill them with some dried seed, and they're really attractive. And I always invite people to come up afterwards and help themselves, take a nice sample away, and enjoy growing them themselves. And they're quite striking to look at, and really, really lovely varieties we can make available. So on this one occasion, I'd been doing some talking, and somebody, a couple turned up right at the end, arrived right at the end of it, and one of them politely came up and asked if they could come and take some of the seed away, and of course, I was very happy for them to help themselves, and they selected some really particularly nice coloured, bi-colour French bean seed, a really nice bean seed, really shiny, pretty thing. Anyway, this gentleman came back a few minutes later and he really wasn't looking very pleased. And he said, I've just given these to my wife and she says they taste terrible. I had to explain that they were actually weren't sweet at all. It's really not a very great idea to crunch your way through some dried beans.
Well, that's
all the usual preparations. So I think he saw the funny side, but he was absolutely baffled and clearly not entirely impressed with my beautiful selection of shiny beans.
Yeah, he won't do that again, will he? In a hurry. Oh, that's great.
No one should. I must hasten to add, they really shouldn't pop dry bean seeds in the mouth, but
no.
I think he learnt his lesson, and so did he.
That's it. Excellent. Well, thank you for that. And I'd just like to say a big thank you from us as a garden centre and someone who grows plants. It's fantastic work that you're doing up at the Doubleday Research Centre, and it's so good to hear from people who are trying to sort of diversify and keep the old heritage varieties of vegetables growing, because it is a massive sort of resource, and it's so good to keep it going and not just hide it all away and forget about them.
Yeah, indeed.
Well, thank you for inviting me to talk about it, and I completely agree. Our mantra is really the best way to conserve these varieties is to get people growing them again, and it's really great when we can share the stories and the great varieties, great flavours, and interesting plants with people, and it makes what we do worthwhile. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Catrina. And how do our Dig-It listeners find out more about the seed, the Heritage Seed Library?
Absolutely. Well, you can pop onto the Garden Organic website, so www.gardenorganic.org.uk, and we do lots of projects related to communities and organic growing and research and campaigning. But you'll find there's a section there on what we do, and if you follow the links to the Heritage Seed Library, there'll be a little bit of information about what we do on site here, how you can get involved, how you can join. We always very welcome new members. And a bit of information about getting involved, potentially as seed guardians if a member wanted to do that as well. So please take a look. It's also worth saying that all of the seed saving advice is available for free on the website as well. So if you haven't saved seed before, or if you fancy taking on a trickier crop, then there are lots of resources there that you can access for free to help you get started.
That's brilliant, Catrina. That's lovely. And thank you again. And just finally, about 5 or 6 years ago, we were seed guardians at the garden centre here. We did do a little bit one summer, and if I remember rightly, we did have an amazing crop of beans, some amazing coloured beans. So maybe some of those beans you've been chatting about today is what we were growing there. So it was a really good exercise, and it was good for our staff as well to get involved in growing plants they probably never grow before, and maybe never grow again. You know, it's that little snapshot of trying something and experiencing a lot of these heirloom varieties. So thank you for your great work, and thanks for joining us on Dig It today.
Thank you. Not at all. Thank you too.
Thank you. Today's show was brought to you by Buckingham Garden Centre and Nurseries. The show was hosted by Chris Day and Peter Brown. The show was produced by Peter Brown. And our thanks to Chiltern Music Therapy for providing the music. Thanks for listening.
At Chiltern Music Therapy, we want everyone to know the difference that music can make in their lives. From parents and their premature babies in hospital to grandparents with dementia. We provide music therapy and community music services to people of all ages and needs across England. We work both digitally and in person in people's homes, care homes, schools, hospitals and hospices. Find out more at chilternmusictherapy.co.uk.